Okay guys, welcome back to Strength Forge. My name is John and today we're going to be taking you through the different phases of my deadlift cycle leading up to what I'm hoping to be a 300 kilo deadlift later on this year. Now, as a disclaimer, this isn't a training cycle that I would necessarily prescribe for everyone else until it has been tried and tested at least, because obviously there is an element of individuality here. This program was completely bespoke to my current situation, the equipment I have available during this lockdown period, but also down to what my pre-existing training was before this deadlift cycle. This video series is going to be broken down into two parts. I'm going to talk about phase 1 and 2 today, and then 3 and 4 in the second episode. And we're also going to start just by talking about where I was leading into this cycle. So I was training for the BNSF, the British Natural Strongman Federation, under 105 kilo qualifier, the Northern Strongest Man, working on obviously getting towards Britain's. During this, there was a couple of different events that were dynamic in nature and also ones that were static in nature. In reference to the deadlift, we had Atlas stones that we had to work on, okay, which is a similar movement pattern in terms of concentric bias and picking the weight up off the floor. But we also had a deadlift medley in which I shifted a lot of my training towards being able to handle exercise complexity within the deadlift, so different implements, different heights and so on. During this, during my training cycle leading up to this, I'd placed a heavy emphasis on work capacity and gradually tapered down into more of an intense block in which I focused on the neurological aspects. So I would have it rotated each week, but I would do 20 minutes on the clock, as many sets of 3, for example, with about 80% as I could, whilst maintaining obviously the technique that I wanted to make sure that the injury risk was low. Then sets of 2, then sets of 1. I was doing really heavy block pulls on a weekly basis to try and overload my CNS and so on. And as a result, coming into this lockdown period, I also had to shift my business structure around slightly, so my stress in terms of my cortisol response was slightly high. So what I did was set up the phases so that I had a decent base to work with, which is phase 1, known as work capacity and athletic preparedness. And basically took the element of specificity away from the deadlift, even though this is obviously my goal, and centered it around trying to improve my overall health, my recovery rate, and kind of nullifying a few of the specialized effects that I'd gained from that training cycle leading up to BNSF. A couple of examples of those would be, I felt quite heavy on my feet when I would move, just because of the weight of the yoke that I was working with, and I was doing that on a pretty regular basis. During the taper, that naturally would have dropped off and I'd have moved a little bit quicker, but I just felt a little bit larger than I like to be. I was a couple of kilos heavier than I normally am. I typically walk around at about 100 kilo body weight, which is about, I think it's about 16 stone, and I'm actually quite light for the under 105 kilo class, but for the nature of this competition, I was in a pretty dense bulk, so I was eating a high amount of calories, and I was up at about 103, 104. So I wanted to bring that down as well, not only to improve my leverage for the deadlift, but also just to feel a little bit better due to the nature of what I planned. So what we're going to do is I'm going to watch the video along with you guys so I can talk about each of the different exercises, why they were programmed in, and again, if you've got any questions about different exercises, about the phases, how they were programmed, just leave a comment below and I will get back to them immediately. So let's dive straight in. So like I said, the first phase was work capacity and athletic preparedness. The main focus here was to basically make myself a better athlete rather than a better strongman. I'm a huge believer in the size of your base will determine the height of your peak. Well, it's not a belief, it's a mathematical law, but basically it doesn't always have to be specific right from the get-go. So what I did was employ a high rep protocol with goblet squats. Main reason I chose goblet squats, they're very, very low in complexity compared to other squatting variations, so I can push towards a momentary muscular failure and try and elicit a high amount of training volume without necessarily having joint inflammation like I might get in terms of sore elbows if it's in the back squat or that type of thing. My goal here was to work up to doing 40 kilo goblet squat for 2 sets of 30 within the same session, which I did. And again, as you can see by the way I'm performing them, the goal was to keep the muscle under tension for as long as possible. Primary reason behind this, in terms of utilising the high rep protocol, although it's not necessarily specific to strength, it forms the platform to be able to recover, at least on a muscular level, to recover from the amount of training volume that I would be doing later on in phase 3. So again, it was just purely focusing on keeping as much muscle tension as possible, produce as much lactic acid as I could, and also from a mental standpoint, get me familiar with doing things that I don't like doing. I hate high reps, I always have done. If I could go in and do one heavy deadlift every single day for the rest of my life, that would actually be pretty happy as long as I progress, but we know that's not the case. So again, the high rep goblet squats were purely there to challenge me mentally and physically, and from a notion of something known as phase potentiation, which is where one phase of training sets up for the next. Again, the goal was purely to improve my recovery rate. Also, it involved me utilizing different exercises like sandbag to shoulder, and as you can see, just generalized movement patterns in between. So I was jogging on the spot there, I'd occasionally do jumping jacks, burpees, your typical exercise class cardio based movements. Again, purely to improve my recovery rate, okay? I actually really enjoy the sandbag as well, so there was that kind of balance between something I hated, which was high rep squats, and something I actually enjoyed, which was the sandbag, because it replicates the stone lifting, which is my absolute favorite event. So again, I would do these at the start of the session as well, the high rep goblet squats and the sandbag, prior to doing any other movement, whether it be the deadlift on that day, whether it be the back squat that I would use to obviously challenge the strength side of things. I was getting used to training under fatigue, at least from an acute level, so that later on in the training cycle, when it was chronic fatigue from the amount of reps that I was doing, my body could handle it. And again, in terms of how this influences you guys, it's important to be aware of assessing your current situation, and how suitable your training has been and how suitable your current physical fitness is towards a goal. And the amount of base level training that you will need to do will be based off how far away from you are from that goal. You know, if you were a powerlifter and you're going to go in for a marathon, it would be stupid, just flat out stupid, to dive straight in. You would need to create a pretty large base for your body to be able to handle that amount of training. Now, as you can see here, I did single leg RDLs, really high reps on this. I was upwards of 50 to 100 reps every session, just to try and improve that hip stability, make sure that my glute med was firing during the hip hinge pattern, so that the stability of my pelvis was on point, so to speak. Bit of a cheesy implement to use, but I did use a sledgehammer as well. It's an offset implement, so because it's off on one side, the side that I'm pushing the leg back on, it was pulling me to one side, it was challenging that hip stability a little bit more on the other side. Then I used pause front squats. Now, I'm a huge fan of front squats anyway, particularly for the sport of strongman. I think they have more carryover to pretty much every single athletic movement than the back squat does. However, the main caveat being you can't lift as much weight, and that's exactly why I use them, okay? I know myself that if I can lift heavy, I will, even if it's not within my best interests. It's just the way I really enjoy lifting heavy. So I often implement exercises that are where I am obligated to not lift as heavy as I possibly can. Even if I wanted to push the front squat to the absolute limit, we know that the higher the intensity of the movement, so the higher the load, the greater the disruption it has to other bodily systems. So a max back squat is harder to recover from, at least for 99% of the people I've ever come across, than a max pause front squat. Now, I'm a huge fan of sprints as well. I think that many athletes could benefit from doing them. Many people could benefit from doing them. However, there's one disclaimer that I need to say. Sprinting is a very highly neurological demanding exercise, and also it requires a lot of coordination, which means the injury risk can be slightly higher. Easiest way to mitigate this is to start on a hill. The flatter the surface, okay, the greater that speed that you're going to be moving at, the greater the chance of muscle strain. So I always do my sprints on a slight incline, just to make sure that I'm not necessarily predisposing myself to the injury risk. And I just do these sets of 5, again, about midway through my session towards the end, just to make sure that my body is familiar with that feeling of being light on my feet, so I can feel a little bit more athletic within the training. Again, the further away you are from a training cycle, or rather from a goal, the higher the degree of variation you can use, and this is a time that you can start to focus on weak points. So I implemented a lot of stiff leg deadlifts. The way I'm built and the way I deadlift, I utilize a lot of leg drive, but it kind of leaves my hamstrings out of the movement as much as other people with a higher hip position might get. So I used stiff leg deadlifts, again, sets of 5, just working on drilling the utilization of my hamstrings and my glutes within the movement. And then during this phase as well, again, the load was relatively low. That's why I would do the other exercises, the high rep goblet squats and the sandbag to shoulder at the start, to fatigue myself, so that I was obligated to not lift as heavy as I possibly could, just to try and build up that base as wide as possible. And then towards the end of this cycle, I started to phase in deadlifts. Now, I'm a big believer when it comes to auto-regulation. When we have, I'm just going to pause the video a second. When we have different phases of training, unless you are going into a specific date for a competition, in which case you have to be at a certain standard, I'm a big believer of using objective auto-regulation to assess whether or not you're ready for the next phase of training. All this means is you're going off how you feel, but also how well your body is tangibly performing. So for example, with the deadlift, I always use 200 kilos as a marker. If I can rep 200 kilos for at least more than 8 reps, I know that my body is feeling pretty fit from a cardiovascular, from a muscular standpoint, ready for the next amount of volume. And I know obviously this number 200 will change the stronger I become, but at this stage I use 200 kilos again because it's something that's familiar. If I could get to a set of 10, I know that I was ready to move on to the next phase of training, which I did. Was fairly straightforward. The only thing that I really struggled with was breathing mechanics, just from the high rep side of things. But yeah, 200 to 10 felt pretty comfortable, so I moved on to the next phase of training. And I strongly recommend everyone has that kind of marker to know when their body is ready to move on. You'll see in the next episode as well, within phase 2 and phase 3, I utilize the back squat as an objective measure of my fatigue level. I use the back squat at a 200 kilo marker just to see how fit I feel as the training is going on, not necessarily just before it like I did here. So the next phase of training was the neurological potentiation. Now this phase was purely centered around trying to overload my CNS, get the motor unit recruitment at a higher level, so try and bring in those larger motor units, and allow my body to express force at a higher degree within a variety of different movements. Now, again, going back to that point about maximal effort work, the heavier you lift, okay, the greater disruption you tend to have to other bodily systems, as I said. But there are 3 ways of recruiting larger motor units. There is maximal effort, repetition effort, where we fatigue on a localized level, so we fatigue the muscle. As it gets fatigued, obviously it will start to recruit larger motor units. And then we also have the dynamic effort method. Now the dynamic effort is moving at higher velocities. Benefit of this is you don't get the same disruptions to other bodily systems. It's not as demanding, at least from an endocrinological, as a word for you, standpoint, to perform movements at higher velocities. So I was kind of already doing it with the sprints, but I'm a huge fan of jump training as well, plyometrics, that type of thing, to encourage the movement, encourage rapid movement, overload the CNS a little bit, but again, not necessarily lifting too heavy. During this phase as well, I also utilized long pause isometrics. Now, I'm a huge fan of isometrics anyway. There's two different ways of doing them, sorry. There is supramaximal ones where you try and move an object that can't be moved, or just simple static submaximal ones where you hold a position. Within the squat, the main reason I did it within the squat, improved tendon strength, particularly within my patellas and that type of thing, or rather patella tendons, and also focus on the static strength of my mid-back. The way I'd shifted my deadlift, if you've seen the road to 300, 255 for 5, you'll have seen that, but the way I've adjusted my deadlift technique to have slight intentional flexion in my thoracic spine, I wanted to make sure I was doing everything I could to mitigate the side effects of that. So long pause isometrics within a squat position will just help me to reinforce keeping my chest up all the way through. And again, within this, in terms of the amount of time that I held them for, 10, 15 seconds. At one time I pushed it to 30 seconds just because I wanted to see how tough I was mentally, but I wouldn't necessarily prescribe that. And I also used isometric stiff leg deadlifts. I'm a huge fan of isometric deadlifts overall. Main reason I couldn't do isometric deadlifts normally was I didn't have enough weight to pin the bar down. But isometric stiff leg deadlifts, like I said, because I'm weaker in that position, that was relatively straightforward. So maximal pulling against the weight as hard as I can, cueing my glutes and my hamstrings to kick in. The beauty of isometrics is they recruit those larger motor units in the maximal effort method, but because you're not moving, you don't necessarily get the same disruption to things like your skeletal system. And so variation there, the power Bulgarians, just along the same lines as that dynamic effort, using exercises that involve triple extension to try and recruit those larger motor units. And then towards the end of this training cycle, I progressed the long pause isometrics to what's known as a myotatic squat, which is where we emphasize the stretch reflex at the bottom. Now, I know the stretch reflex isn't necessarily involved within the deadlift, but the reason I did this was to train the reflex arc from the CNS to the individual muscles. again, and just get used to moving weight as rapidly as I possibly could, just to get that neurological overload. And during this time, I was still overloading my deadlift. Okay, so I still was gradually increasing this. I think I've built up to 220 for 6 or maybe 8, something like that. Just doing that AMRAP on that final set. Okay guys, so that was phase 1 and phase 2 of my training cycle, why I structured it that way, and ultimately setting myself up for the phase 3 and phase 4 that I'm in right now. If you like the video, please leave a like below. If you've got any questions about any of the phases of training, or if you want any advice on how you should structure your training cycles, again, please leave a comment and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And stay tuned for episode 2, where we talk about total volume overload and increase in specificity, and then confidence and tapering at the end. Stay strong.